You have some familiarity as far as either watching either one or part two of Making a Murder, or just keeping up with the case in the media at all? Then, for the most part, is that fair to say? Okay, great. Okay, that helps. That helps me a little bit then. So anyway, I grew up in Joliet and went to high school in Plainfield. So this is actually the second time I've been back here to give a presentation. The last time was about 5 years ago, in 2014, after my first book came out. Case when I used to work in Omaha, Nebraska. But the Steve Avery case is definitely the most interesting case that I've ever covered that I could think of, as far as just the unbelievable nature of the case and just so many different facets of it. And it's really the first case that I really covered where I've dealt with a lot of cases that got a lot of national media exposure, but really the Steve Avery case is the first one where it had strong, very strong international coverage. And along those lines, too, with Netflix, which was fairly new back in 2015, to really have a documentary kind of drive the narrative and kind of drive the coverage. And one of the things that was really kind of a fallout or an aftermath of Netflix was that the local police and a lot of the media were really ragging on, criticizing Making a Murder after it came out, and said that it was, it wasn't really telling the true story, or certain parts of it were selectively edited, or certain facts of the case were really withheld and not part of the story. So I was fortunate that I was in a position back then. I was working in Wisconsin. I was with the USA Today network. So I was really in a position where I was able to really kind of dig into the case on a daily basis for a year and a half. And I was just expected to produce, a story a week for the most part, sometimes more. But just really try to dig into the case and find out what's really the truth, and also look at some of the layers underneath the case, underneath the surface, and really try to dig into, what really, wasn't shown in Making a Murder, not because the documentarians did a bad job. I think they did a great job, but just but were there other aspects of the case that really the public, people like yourselves and myself, really didn't know because it didn't come out at the original trial. So eventually, and then that's kind of what ultimately led me to write a book on the case. I wanted to, since there had been 2 or 3 books that came out, I think, right after Making a Murder, and they were all very, kind of cheerleader type of books. They were either written by a prosecutor or it just kind of really didn't dig into the case from the standpoint of, looking at the truth, looking at the evidence against Stephen Avery or Brendan Dassey, or looking at the corruption of the police. So I figured if I'm going to do a book on the case, it's got to be unique. It's got to be something that'll stand out. And I thought I was in a position, being an investigative reporter at that point in time, and being in Wisconsin, and having a good working knowledge of Wisconsin and that area, that being on the ground really put me in a unique position. So it was just a matter of time of once things came together, I felt that I had enough information to really put together a compelling book. And the angle I really tried to zero in on was one that nobody else had done before, and that was really having a relationship, having a connection as a journalist, having had interviewed Kathleen Zellner on a number of occasions, to try to put the book together from the standpoint of, here she is, she comes onto the case kind of cold, 2016, so basically a month after Making a Murder comes out. And she was just like the rest of us. She really didn't know the case inside and out, but had some, good suspicions, being a long-time, highly decorated wrongful conviction lawyer here in Illinois, just up the road in Downers Grove. But she had a really good knowledge that from her other cases, as far as what's a legitimate prosecution and which ones really kind of smell. And the other thing too is she got a chance. She went up and met Avery in person, and that really convinced her. Get a chance to meet him one-on-one, look him in the eye, having a face-to-face. That she felt pretty confident just from spending time with him. That he wasn't a bullshit artist. That he was sincere, and he's always been very firm, resolute that he had nothing to do with the case. Going back to a day or two after Teresa Halbach disappeared around on Halloween of 2005, within a couple days of that is when, the authorities went back to Avery Road to question him, and frankly, rightfully so, because it's a known fact that he had an appointment with her that day. But again, she had been on that property to meet Stephen Avery and be on Avery Road probably a dozen times or so over the previous year or year and a half, and nothing bad ever happened to her, and she never had any issues as far as that she was scared or intimidated or frightful about going out to Avery Road and meeting with Stephen. So those are key facts to kind of put that all in perspective, because the prosecution basically portrayed Stephen as this scary, creepy boogeyman, that was just this monster, and as soon as anybody would show up on Avery Road, he was going to basically eat them and and burn them and just do all these really horrible things to whoever that was. And again, you just got to put that in perspective, that this was somebody that lost 18 years of their life to a wrongful conviction for a violent crime that they didn't commit, and they're in the middle of winning or settling for a lot of money, a $36 million lawsuit, which, as I reported previously, if that thing had settled out of court, he for sure was looking at somewhere between $10 million and $12 million, just based on the averages that I went through looking at other wrongful conviction cases around the country, how much those had settled for at that point in time. So if the case had settled, he still would have done pretty well, for $10 to $12 million, probably on the minimum. But either way, he was in real good shape. He was poised to become a multi-millionaire, and probably would have bought up a bunch of restaurants and gas stations and maybe a dirt track here or there. But again, that's all going on right around the same time that Teresa Halbach disappears, and the fingers pointed at him, and the authorities lock in on him from the get-go. So Zellner gets involved in the case early on, and the one thing that she has that everybody else really doesn't have up to this point in time is a lot of street credibility, where she's been involved in a number of other high-profile cases around the country, around Chicagoland, and has been able to be in the same situation where the public, the press, everybody assumed that all these people, that are pictured here, were guilty of sin, that they committed these murders. A jury had, found them guilty, or a judge had found them guilty. A lot of them had lost their appeals over time too, which is an important thing to remember, because oftentimes with wrongful conviction cases, it takes several years and several defeats throughout the appeals process before you finally get a judge or a crucial piece of evidence or something you uncover that ultimately has the court step back and say, wait a minute, this is, this one deserves a timeout. This is the card that'll deserves you to get a do-over as far as your criminal conviction is concerned. So she's just a real, tenacious, hard-charged person. But the one thing I found really interesting, getting a chance to know her and interview her and just watch her work, is that she's constantly working on these cases where sometimes an attorney, might, they have a court, let's just say the case is scheduled for trial. Let's just use March, since we're in March 31st, okay? They're going to be working their butt off, knowing that they're going to court on March 31st. They go to court, things go okay, the judge takes it under advisement. Zellner will be the type of person that she'll be still working on the case April 1st, April 2nd, even waiting for whatever ruling is going to come down. She'll still stay at it with the case. So even though she's filed briefs on this case, even as of a week ago on March 11th, about 40 to 45 pages plus exhibits, she's still probably doing work this current week, or having her investigators still following up on things, taking calls, taking tips, taking suggestions. So that's the one thing that really kind of sets her apart from most criminal defense lawyers or civil attorneys that are working on either criminal defense work or post-conviction cases for people that they're trying to prove were wrongly convicted of a crime. So that's just one thing to point out with her. And as I mentioned before, Avery Road is definitely the last known spot. But what was really interesting, Zellner was able to find, and this didn't come out really in the first Making a Murder series, but after it came out, somebody that had moved far away from Wisconsin had came forward and remembered that, lo and behold, on the day before Teresa Halbach's vehicle turned up on the Avery salvage yard, which most people remember that. That was a huge event in Making a Murder, and it changed the direction of the case. But lo and behold, there was posters that were all around the Manitowoc area in general. And there was a guy that had walked into the local gas station right on the outskirts of Mishicot, little town not that far from Manitowoc. But he had seen that poster, and it kind of jogged his memory because he had seen a vehicle just like Teresa Hallbeck's just right down the main road, which was Highway 147. So I was going to say 49 and 147, even though I'd driven it several times. But yeah, on Highway 147, it was kind of buried off the road, tucked away in a little area that's kind of called a turnabout. And I've been out there several times before. And lo and behold, it turns out that there were several different people that lived in the area or were passersby that had seen the same darn vehicle stashed, back off the road during the days after Teresa Hallbeck had disappeared. What's interesting is that you will not find one single you really won't find much as far as any police reports that document the fact that this was found out there. There's calls to the sheriff's office about this, but you don't find any evidence about anybody from Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office going out to this spot and finding this vehicle or confirming that it was there. But this guy that saw this poster remembered that, and he's very resolute that he bumped into a sheriff's deputy that day that was at the gas station, and it happened to be, just as coincidence always is, follows this guy around, it happened to be Andy Colburn, who's one of the most famous, or infamous, I should say, characters in this whole case. And he was the individual you may remember from Making a Murder that was really on the witness stand, where he just really looks like he's lying, and just really looks like he's covering stuff up about the whole infamous license plates that were called in to dispatch, where he rattles off the Sam William Henry, and then he follows up and says, was it Toyota? Yeah. It basically confirms that it was a Toyota RAV4 that she was driving. So, but that was the day that Andy Colburn was off. He was not working that Friday, and I always found that that's one of the most peculiar parts of this whole case, is that Colburn was actually deposed right before this case went to trial, when he was being looked at as a possible evidence planter along with his boss, and he was sat down for an interview by the Calumet Sheriff's Department, and they asked him they went through his whole week, what the hell he did every single day, and he was very, he had a real good memory on pretty much everything except for that day. I mean, he remembered back to Sunday that he always goes over his mother-in-law's house to check on her because she was older, and he would go there before he went to church. And but when they got to Friday, the day after he had worked and put in a full 12 or 14-hour day, trying to find Teresa Hallbeck, which is noble and is doing the right thing, he can't remember and is allowed to vouch for saying that he doesn't remember anything what he did that Friday. So again, I always found that suspicious. So then you got a guy that has no dog in the fight, so to speak, who had never watched Making a Murderer when it came out, but a year or so after Making a Murderer came out, finally got around to watching it or seeing it, and some of these facts, jogged his memory, and he remembered the fact that he had bumped into a sheriff's deputy, and he remembered the face from seeing Making a Murderer. So those are the kinds of things that somebody like Kathleen Zellner, and I think only a Kathleen Zellner kind of person, is able to, pull out and kind of build upon that, because she didn't just take this guy at his, face value. Her investigators ultimately met up with him in person. They went out to the area, and she made sure that this lead was legitimate, because believe me, I mean, she's probably getting 100 tips for every one that proves to be true like that. And that's what a smart lawyer and smart investigators do, is that they flush this stuff out to make sure, because there's no doubt that there's people that are noble, that are trying to help Stephen Avery out, but probably either just have bad memories or maybe just inventing things too, just thinking that it's doing the right thing, and where this is a legitimate lead that she followed up on. So again, I want you to remember the fact that that the real set of events, the real facts of the case, in my opinion, aren't what was presented at the original trial, the 5 or 6 week long trial that happened in 2007 with Stephen and certainly not with Brendan, but my book focuses mostly on Stephen's case. But in a lot of respects, the two do overlap because, Brendan Dassey gets pulled into the case, 3 or 4 months later, after Stephen's already been incarcerated for the crime. But you didn't hear much about Cuss Road. It wasn't mentioned really at all in the original trial when Stephen's case went to trial back in '07. And if you really study the reports and see what was left out of trial, the original trial, you'll see that a lot of the police presence was really focused in on this area. And just for perspective, this is about a half a mile away from where Stephen Avery and the Avery salvage yard property is. And the salvage yard property is about 40 acres. It's kind of like a shoebox. And it's surrounded by a lot of quarries. And basically, if you kind of jog through, cut through, walk through the quarries, you'll end up on this real desolate, I wouldn't say it's a deserted road because you have about 5 or 6 little acreages, houses kind of off behind the trees here on both sides of the street. But it's a very lonely road, and basically anything that could happen out here pretty much would go undetected and would go unnoticed. I think even somebody that screamed at the top of their lungs probably wouldn't be heard, unless somebody happened to be maybe 100 yards away, at one of the nearby quarries. But the belief is that this could have been the area where Teresa Halbach may have been harmed, either attacked or slain, but kind of off in this area here. And the reason why this area looks like a very logical position for a number of reasons, but one was the fact that there was a number of police cadaver dogs and scent dogs that were really, back in '05 now, that were really zeroed in on this area, and that's where the police were taking them. And they gave these dogs some soles from the shoes of Teresa Halbach to kind of use as a scent. And this whole area around here was really, where the dogs were kind of going wild. And again, these weren't rookie dogs either. The state of Wisconsin had brought in some of the best dogs around. I think it was with the Great Lakes, region, that rescue group. But nonetheless, this was the area where the dogs were focused in on. But because that really would not advance the prosecution's theory that Steve Avery was involved in the case, or it would put the murder in abduction or kidnapping or attack about half a mile away from Avery's property, these kinds of reports and documentation, were really downplayed and kind of kept out of the case. So everybody's working off of the public's thinking that Stephen Avery attacks Teresa Halbach, out at his trailer. They lures her inside and attacks her in his trailer, and then takes her out to his garage where he and Brendan finish the job, so to speak, and then eventually move her body out to the back of the property. And in reality, a lot of the evidence and a lot of the leads were pointing to this area a half mile away, which then raises the question, well, what's the likelihood that Stephen Avery did the crime if all the evidence is kind of pointing away from Stephen Avery and away from the salvage yard? And again, there was a lot of these little, very, very, very important pieces of evidence that were really diminished and basically non-factors at the original case. And again, these are all things that really don't help the prosecution. And as a reporter, I've always tried to find these kinds of little nuggets out there, because sometimes these are the little things that are huge and can really blow up a case. And I've seen this in a lot of wrongful conviction cases that I've written about. But sometimes it's just one or two really overlooked or obscure pieces of evidence are really the most important. They're the mountains of the case. But you wouldn't know that because they get buried or overlooked, or sometimes they're intentionally forgotten about. So again, if you're working off of the theory that somehow Stephen Avery committed the murder, like just talked about, then you would have to have Stephen Avery, getting in her vehicle, turning the ignition, driving this about quarter mile, through the mud, through up the road, and putting it on the back of his own family's property and kind of leaving it out there. Well, the one thing that's really peculiar and stands out is the fact that you had this was not evident on her vehicle before she disappeared. Her family, nobody in her family, when they're putting out those posters that we just saw a couple slides ago, I mean, there's no mention at all as far as being on the lookout for a RAV4 that's got front end damage. And if you or I disappeared tonight, and our car had something that was stood out, like a broken window or or a blinker light that's not working, that would be one of the first things you'd want to put out to the police and the public or on social media is give somebody the most clear identifier. And that wasn't put out at the time she disappeared because everybody that knew her probably didn't know that her car had been damaged. And it's just a real small little area of the vehicle that gets damaged. And then what's even more bizarre about the whole deal is that whoever did bump into something or hit something here, they're going to have to get out of the vehicle and pick up that blinker light, and then they decide to throw it in the back of the vehicle, which again is another really odd set of circumstances as far as why would the person do that. And again, one logical scenario is that you don't want to leave that broken blinker light behind if you screwed up. If you were moving this vehicle or driving this vehicle or towing this vehicle to put it on Stephen Avery's property, the last thing you want to do is, if you do have a fumble, a mistake that happens, especially late at night, you're not going to want to leave that blinker light behind because defense attorney gets their hands on that, then everybody's going to be going to jail, and you're not going to have a Steve Avery prosecution back in 2005. Okay, so it's really crafty and really, interesting looking back at the case as far as, so not only does somebody make a mistake, bump into something or cause this vehicle to get damaged, but then they're going to go to the level of making sure that parts of the vehicle that got damaged then are going to stay with the vehicle. And I always found it really interesting looking at the case years later is that why don't the police try to get to the bottom of that? Even if Stephen Avery was the murderer or Brenda Dassey, why wouldn't you still want to get to the bottom of trying to find out how to connect that broken blinker light to Stephen Avery or Brendan Dassey? Why aren't you interrogating them if you're Mark Wiegert and Tom Fassbender? Why aren't you asking Stephen Avery all kinds of questions about the broken blinker light and asking him about, how could he have put it in the back? And so the fact that really gets downplayed and really isn't mentioned at all by the prosecution, again, that's another thing that points to the strong possibility that this vehicle was found at a different location, probably at the turnabout, and then somebody, probably at least two people, two vehicles, are going to have to move this vehicle and get it onto the Avery property. So the question really becomes then, who would do that? Is it, somebody that's trying to help Teresa Hallbuck's family, because they really believe the police have convinced them that Stephen Avery is the killer, and we know he's the killer for, the police saying something like, we know he's the killer, but we need to have a little more evidence to prove it? Or could it just be the cops doing it on their own? And that's really kind of up for, it's never been proven one way or the other. I go back and forth on it sometimes too. I could see it being both a combination of people that were connected to Teresa Hallbuck that were trying to find her vehicle, helping out with the police on this deal, but again, that might help explain why some people have never been completely cooperative with the case too, as far as witnesses go. But nonetheless, putting that little piece back in the vehicle, as a lot of people point out to me, that's something a cop would do. That would be more likely that police would want to pick up a piece, like that, and not leave it behind. Whereas, in all likelihood, the killer probably wouldn't have given, a real care or afterthought if it had really happened during the crime. So, and again, other key points too. Back at the original trial, it was represented, it was portrayed that Stephen and Brendan killed Teresa Hallbuck in the garage area. Right. Well, we've got a good one right here. That she gets shot inside there, and then they're going to immediately move her. And again, remember, it's Halloween, so there's a lot of people doing bonfires and on Halloween throughout Wisconsin, not just at Avery's, but nonetheless, he did have a bonfire going that night, but it wasn't like anything sinister. I mean, in my opinion, just the fact that it was Halloween. So, but it was portrayed that Stephen Avery would have thrown her body into this into this burn pit, and burned her body on a 40-degree night, on Halloween, with having no experience whatsoever as far as understanding a decomposition or the breakdown of a human body and how to do that. And I thought, from spending time out at Avery's property, going out there several times in 16 and 17, I was really amazed by how close in proximity the garage is to where this area, this is the burn pit, but it's 10 years later, 12 years later, so it's kind of been overgrown now. I mean, this is what it looked like then, but that's what it looks like now. So the burn pit, you really can't see much anymore, but it's kind of filled in. It looks like a crater. It looks like something, a meteor had landed and it's been kind of filled in. But nonetheless, I was really struck by the fact that if this really was an area where Teresa Halbach's body was burned, this garage would have gone up in smoke, and you can't see it with this photo that I took, but over here was a propane tank. It wasn't that far away. So this whole area, in my opinion, if this was a wildfire, crazy fire that was where flames were 10 feet high, as Scott Todich, claimed once he finally went to trial and the prosecution needed, a star witness to help them out. But I think that this whole area would have gone up, and that's a rickety garage. I mean, it still amazes me this thing's standing up, and I don't know if I'd want to walk in there. But it just, I can't believe it's still standing, but it is, even though it's missing a few boards there. But I just think that this thing would have gone up in smoke. But what's really interesting is that, it was portrayed and the jury convicted Stephen Avery based on those facts. Fast forward 10 years to Kathleen Zellner getting in on the case. She brings in all these different people from around the country, and the world for that matter, as far as some of the best people at their own specialty in forensic science, or ballistics, or guns, or DNA. And they specialize in a certain piece of evidence with this case. And one of the persons she brought in is a fire expert out of California, John DeHaan. And what's interesting, just studying the case, looking at the files, was that Dean Strang and Jerry Buting had researched John DeHaan when they were getting ready to go to trial with Stephen's case, and they had at least pulled his curriculum vitae, and done some research on him, but then they never followed up and made a phone call or never even pursued him as an expert witness. So, it was a lost cause. But Zellner tracked this guy down, and she didn't even know as far as all those facts. But DeHaan's one of the best in the world as far as studying the incineration of bodies and what's legitimate and what's preposterous. And he came to the conclusion, just from studying this case, studying the temperatures, studying the facts of the case, that this was not the area where Teresa Halbach, was where her body was destroyed or incinerated. And usually what happens is whoever's going to incinerate a body is going to want to do it fast, okay? And they're often going to do it, in a method that they're going to be comfortable with, but also that they'll know what they're doing. And usually the two of the fastest ways to burn up a body are putting it in the trunk of a car, actually, or inside of a car. And I saw this happen, actually, well, I didn't see it happen, but last year in Joliet, I covered a case like that that's still unsolved on Rowell Avenue, where two gangbangers were killed in the back seat of the car, and the car was driven out by Laraway School, the new Laraway School, not far from the racetrack, and the car was set on fire. And the authorities went out there, not knowing that there was any bodies in the car, and then they put out the fire, and they found two bodies in the back seat of the car, and they've both been shot. So that's common, and that's the way that most people are going to do that. Or they'll put a body inside of a barrel, and that happened last October in Joliet too, a case that's been solved. But so again, this happens fairly frequently, and usually that's the way it's going to go down. So again, the idea that Stephen Avery, who is a novice, doesn't have any experience with fire as far as burning bodies, the idea that somehow he's going to make an impulsive decision that I'll throw a fire on since it's Halloween and we'll get this body cooked really quickly. is just, really unbelievable. So again, you got to work off of the facts of the case as far as what's really true and what's reality. And I would take somebody like John DeHaan at his word, being one of the best experts in the United States and the world, a guy that knows what he's doing and can prove, and can replicate and do studies and do reenactments, versus somebody from Manitowoc County or the Calumet County Sheriff's Office that has zero experience dealing with these kind of cases, and really zero experience working on a complex murder case that's happening in real time, that's getting a lot of media attention and scrutiny. That you can almost see a situation where people are kind of inventing theories and going along thinking that the press and the public, in this area, this region that they live in, are gullible and just aren't going to know any better, and are going to be willing to fall for this stuff. So what's real in Making a Murder Part 1, Dean Strang and Jerry Buting did allude to the fact that there was, where those dogs I talked about were getting some potential hits, and they were finding different, areas. But what they really didn't do, they didn't really develop it as well as they could have and should have, was the fact that that a lot of these areas, that there were bones that were in fact found that did prove to be human, that were found in that quarry area. And again, Jax, correct me if I'm wrong. Let's see. So Avery's with Steve's property. Steve's house will be right up there. Is that right?
Correct.
Somewhere there. Okay, good. Okay, that was good. That was a good guess. So again, so you got Steve Avery. The area we just looked at right here, okay, is really right here. Okay. So these are the areas where the dogs were getting a lot of their alerts, and this would be the area where the vehicle was found. So that's not a big. That would make sense to me. But again, a lot of it's going to be this area here, and these areas over here are, again, where these pelvic bones that were found and were discussed during the trial, the original trial. But it was portrayed by the prosecution that these were not human bones, and the anthropologist, who was kind of a cheerleader, kind of knew what she needed to do for the prosecution. They expected her to testify in a way that was going to be favorable for them convicting Stephen Avery. But she was good at she is good, she's a good anthropologist, but she's just, kind of under pressure and knows, what's expected of her. But she did acknowledge at the trial that these were, possible or probable human bones. But what was going on at that point in time was that nobody was really going to the next level of trying to prove on the state side, the prosecution side, that these really were Teresa Halbach's bones. And then you also come to find out, this is stuff that Zellner and only Zellner had figured out on her own just by looking at coordinates, because there was a lot of these coordinates that were, in these police reports, this is how things are labeled. They don't say human bones are found, at this location, that location, that location. They tried to make it as difficult as possible, for whoever is going to look at Stephen Avery's case after the fact, or a defense lawyer. They'd have to find the stuff out on their own. And Zellner's people, just in the last year or so, ultimately dissected and went through these coordinates, and were able to figure out that some of these bones that are being talked about really were human bones that were found, again, out in these quarry areas. So you have them at 3 different locations. And like I said, over here and the other 2 spots over there, which again, some of this matches up with other evidence. There was a lot of I would say there was more strong circumstantial evidence that would prove all this stuff than there was if you look back as far as the circumstantial evidence that Teresa Halbach was killed in Stephen Avery's garage and harmed and attacked in Stephen Avery's bedroom of his trailer. So it's just, you have a lot of the evidence points to the stronger possibility that this is the area where Teresa Halbach was dismembered, her body was incinerated, was out in this quarry area, probably out at night. And again, only somebody that would do this would be somebody that knows this area, is familiar with this area. And these quarries here actually were owned by Manitowoc County government. They had owned it for decades and decades, and the area was pretty much, it wasn't being used very much, so there weren't too many human beings or people that were out there. It's a very secluded area, and anybody could pretty much run around there during the daytime and even at nighttime, and nobody would see you. So you have to fall back to the the other most important piece of evidence that was really kind of an afterthought of the whole original case, and that was the fact that Teresa Halbach's bones did show up. They were, in fact, inside of a burn barrel. And it wasn't Steve Avery's burn barrel, but it was his nephew's burn barrel at the house that was right next door, about 60 yards away. Because all the Averys kind of lived out in that area on the 40-acre property. But her bones, a small number of her bones, but they were her bones nonetheless, were in fact at the bottom of that burn barrel. And it doesn't make sense at all if Stephen Avery did the crime in his backyard and burned her, that somehow he's going to scoop up a few bones and walk them over to his nephews, put them in there, and leave some behind in his own burn pit area. So I was, just for timeliness sake, I didn't have the video that came along with this, but Kathleen Zellner has done a long reenactment on this case, and it's really good. But basically, and these are two actors, people that she's hooked up with, but they basically went out last year and did a full reenactment to look at the timeline, because again, Zellner's not the type of lawyer that's just going to come up with a theory, just because it sounds great or it's sexy or whatever, or she could get somebody off. She's going to want to prove that she's actually right, that what she's going to court with is the truth, and so she's looked at the possibility that if in fact Teresa Halbach was not killed on Avery Road, and Bobby Dassey, the nephew, again where the burn barrel fellow is concerned, how logical, how much time would it take for Bobby Dassey to hunt Teresa Halbach down under a ruse of, taking photographs of his vehicle, and basically Halbach may have been killed, not a premeditated murder, but it could have been a sexual attack where he tried to rape her and attack her, assault her, and ultimately kills her. So again, this reenactment was done off of Cuss Road, and it only took a few minutes, believe it or not, from the time that Bobby Dassey, if Bobby Dassey was the killer and attacked her, it would only take a couple minutes to get from his place, watching Teresa Halbach leave. And Bobby Dassey did testify to that. He's the only person in the whole world that ever testified that he was watching, and some would argue that he was stalking Teresa Halbach that day, and that he was the only one that testified that he watched her show up. He was watching out of his front window at his house while she was supposedly walking up to Stephen Avery's to have photographs taken of Bobby Dassey's own mother's vehicle that was in the process of being sold. So that's just an important point to mention. And again, Zellner, as I talked about before, she's brought in all these world-class experts, and what's kind of a coincidence is that one of the guys she brought in this case is the guy actually I interviewed 2 books ago that I did. So he's actually got photographs in this book and that book I did in 15 or 16 out of Omaha by a guy named Stuart James. And he's featured prominently in part 2 of Making a Murderer. But Stuart James is he's one of the world's best blood stain experts. And Zellner had just tracked him down, wanting him to take a fresh look at this case, not telling him, hey, here's my theory, go prove it, or along those lines. But he did his own work, he did his own research on several different aspects of blood. But the slide I'm showing you here really looks at where Teresa Halbach may have been harmed, where she was attacked. And because there was a small amount of blood that was found in the back of Teresa Halbach's RAV4. And at the trial, it was just portrayed that Stephen Avery just hoisted her body up, and tossed her into the back of her own vehicle. And then Stephen Avery gets in her vehicle and somehow, because he had some blood on his hands, wipes his own blood on her ignition key area, which is really pretty suspicious, as we all know. But Stuart James did his own blood stain analysis, and he's convinced, and he strongly believes, that the small amount of blood stains that you see on the back area of the vehicle here, came from Teresa Halbach being attacked with a hammer or a wrench or some type of heavy object that would have basically thumped her over the back of the head, and that's what would have caused these really small blood stains
to appear on the back area of the inside of her RAV4 door. And again, this is not just somebody that was just pulled in, off the street. Again, Zellner's, pulling out, the best of the best, to come up with the case as far as where the evidence is taking her. And as of right now, that's the best alternative theory is that Teresa Halbach does get harmed. She's harmed at the back of her vehicle by somebody, whoever it was, that attacked her, and that's what caused the blood spatter on the vehicle. So, again, that's some of the key aspects of the case. There's even been a few different developments on the case, even since I put this book out at the end of November. Zellner is actually probably in the best position that she's ever been in as of right now versus November 20th or October when Making a Murder Part 2 came out. But she's, since my book has even come out, she's been able to, she found other evidence that, getting back to some of those bones that we were looking at before, but come to find out back in 2011 or so, when nobody was paying attention to this case really, as far as people like us, but and it wasn't even, Making a Murder Part 1 hadn't even come out yet, but lo and behold, you find out there had been an order put in place when Stephen Avery was convicted that the Judge Willis, had put together saying that all evidence was going to be saved for future forensic or DNA testing, and both sides agreed to that, okay, back in 2007. Come to find out 4 years later, some of these bones that, again, are found way out here, not from Stephen Avery's burn pit, but bones that were supposedly not even human being bones, that had never been identified as even human being bones. Somehow the Calumet County Sheriff's Office, with the permission and knowledge of the state's attorney, the assistant attorney general Tom Fallon in his office, but they quietly, discreetly gave back some of these bones back to, of all people, the Teresa Halbach's parents, to her family. So this was just discovered in the last few months, and actually it was, I think, a citizen, just
Carol Ann Fitzgerald.
Yeah,
the one that found it.
Yeah, just somebody that was doing their own human research in the case. You call them armchair quarterback, but just somebody that was.
She's a retired police officer in Australia.
Okay.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. So somebody out there that just had an interest in the case and just thought a lot of things didn't smell right, but she was doing her own research on the different pieces of evidence or things that were out there, items, and just stumbled across some police reports that talked about different pieces of evidence being given back to the Halbach family, right?
She FOIA'd it.
Right.
So it's showing that...
That's Freedom of Information Act.
Right.
Yeah.
So the log sheets that Kathleen got just ended at the 2007 saying that this pelvic bone from the gravel pit was in evidence. But now when Carol Ann Fitzgerald, when they got the FOIA documents, you see that in 2011, Wiegert signed them out and Karen Halbach signed to receive them, and it went to a funeral home.
Right. So again, if these were dog bones or moose bones or other animal bones, why in the world would if you're the police or the prosecution, why would you be given bones like that 4 years, 5 years? And again, by doing that, that means that no defense lawyer, Stephen Avery, or a future Kathleen Zellner, if there even was a Kathleen Zellner that would come on the case, but they're not going to even know, let alone being able to do tests on this evidence to prove that these were human, bones, or further your own investigation to prove that if these were really Teresa Halbach's bones, then that pretty much blows up the whole case that the prosecution had at trial, getting back to Stephen Avery committing the murder, in his trailer, and shooting her in the garage with Brendan, and then just burning her body up at this bird at his backyard. Then why in the world would Teresa Halbach's bones be scattered a half mile away, let alone being given back to the family years later, really discreetly and quietly? So Zellner found out about that. She filed some motions related to that. And she's only one of 3 cases that have ever convinced the Wisconsin Court of Appeals to send the case back to district court to add, to to supplement her evidentiary filing as far as a Brady violation. And she believes this is probably the best Brady violation. We haven't talked about that much tonight, and I know we have time. We're constrained on time, but a Brady violation is when you feel that the prosecution basically or the police cheated, where they had evidence that was exculpatory or favorable to the defense or the defendant, and they intentionally or carelessly, withheld that. So, the defense doesn't even know it exists. It may point to another suspect. It may be evidence that shows, a piece of evidence doesn't prove that the man or woman is committed the crime. So it's just those kinds of things. So Zellner has outlined 5 or 6 different Brady violations, but this is the newest one, and it's probably the best one she has. And if you're interested in legal cases, you could look up Arizona versus Youngblood, but that's the criminal case law that Zellner used to convince the Wisconsin Court of Appeals that what happened here is so egregious as far as the prosecution's concerned, as far as the destruction of these bones, that merits a new trial or Stephen Avery's conviction being overturned. So the Court of Appeals agreed that this evidence is important, and they've kicked it back to the same judge who's just basically been a thorn in Zellner's side and really hasn't really even put much time into this case before. So I think there's a petition right now on change.org that has over 20-some thousand signatures from people around the country and the world that have asked this judge to recuse herself. We'll see what happens now. Because Zellner believes that she can't get a fair shake in front of this judge, and this is now the second time that there's been an important ruling that's gone against this judge as far as evidence is concerned that Avery deserves a new trial or to have his conviction overturned. So 2019 will be a really interesting year, and I've told my publisher, we've talked about this, but I'm probably going to try to angle to update the book sometime around June-ish or so then with some of these key developments that have happened since this book came out. But again, most of my book, even though it kind of chronicles what's happened to Stephen Avery in his case since 2007, most of Wrecking Crew really deals with what's happened in the last year to year and a half, really after Zellner's kind of had a lot of time to go through the case. So anyway, that's kind of it in a nutshell. And like I said, I'll try to do my best to answer as many questions as you guys have, either about the case or what may happen here in the future then. So.
I have one. So
Yes.
if these bones were turned back to Teresa Hellbeck's family, who then turned them over to a funeral home, does the funeral home have any record as to what they did with those bones?
I think that's one thing that Zellner, is trying to figure out right now as far as where they're, where they're at. Did the family, because remember, you got to remember, 60%, at least 60% of Teresa Hellbeck's remains have never been found to this day, and the belief is that they probably were incinerated, possibly actually at the Wisconsin aluminum foundry, which I go into detail about that in my book. But no, that's one of the things Zellner's point out in her motions is that she would need to depose, or I should say, she'd need to question in a courtroom the parents, Teresa Hellbeck's parents or Mike, but just the family as far as what did they do with these bones since they were returned. Are they in a cemetery right now? Did they cremate them? I don't know the answer to that right now, but it's again, think about it the other way. I was thinking about if I was Teresa Hellbeck's parents, and I was convinced, or the police had convinced me this whole time that, and I bought into it because I didn't know any better, that the murder had happened, the way the police had portrayed it, and that she was burned up here. I'm trying to figure out how I would be in a situation in 2011, 6 years after the fact, where Mark Wiegert and these guys would come and show up or knock on my door and say, by the way, here's a few extra bones. They're from the quarry that we know the Teresa's, but thanks for really keeping your mouth shut. Or the other side coin, please don't say anything to anybody because we really know Stephen Avery's guilty no matter what.
Right.
I mean, how would it go down? I'm just curious. I've tried to think about that the last few weeks, and it just, I can't come up with a good one. I would almost think the family would have been outraged and aghast and be like, how could you have been fooling us all these years? But the Hellbecks, and I've seen this in other cases, they've always been very loyal and been willing partners to kind of go along and either support the local authorities or just keep their mouths shut. And I had that in the case I wrote my last book on before this,
failure of justice, which 6 people were wrongly convicted. The Washington Post just did a big article on the case a week or 2 ago, but my book came out in 16. But it took years for these people to finally win a $28 to $30 million lawsuit for being framed by a sheriff's deputy in a small town that didn't know. He was actually a pig farmer at the time of the crime, actually, and solved the case in his free time. But with that family, Helen Wilson's family, when I was working on the book, they still didn't want to believe that these 6 people were innocent, had nothing to do with the crime. Even though DNA evidence, even though the state of Nebraska's best, the Attorney General and the governor, these were people that were very pro-law enforcement and very strong conservative people in their beliefs. They actually went against the grain politically to make a very unpopular decision, to throw this case, to start it over and say, no, you guys we prosecuted the wrong people back in 1989. The wrong people went to prison for this case. We're very sad and we got it wrong, but we're getting it right now by proving that this Bruce Smith is the real killer of this crime. But that family was really dumbfounded, and they were struggling for years to believe that, because they sat through the trial, and they watched some of these people even testify, kind of like a Brendan Dassey type, but where they were, some of these people were forced to testify that they committed a crime that they didn't commit. So I'm not going to rip the Hallbucks because I'm not in their shoes, and you don't know what they've been told or what they don't know. So it's just. But it's just one of the things that now, with the dynamics of the case changing so much, you would think that they'd want to step back and reassess everything if, in fact, Teresa Hallbuck's bones, were, in fact, proven to be found out of the quarry, which is what the cadaver dogs and the scent dogs were saying, we're barking, we're saying without saying all along. And as somebody pointed out to me today, which is a great reminder for all of us here, the most honest people in this whole case, the ones that don't have anything, to gain either for defense or the prosecution, of the dogs, they're the ones that can't talk. So they're not gonna lie or pump up the evidence. They're just gonna go where their nose went, and their nose went to those areas, around the quarry and along Cuss Road, half a mile away from Steve Avery's property. So anyway, yeah.
That damaged blinker that came out of the front end of the raft,
Yeah.
that was in the back of the raft?
Yeah, that's a closer up. Andrea, help me with that.
Okay.
Those are 2 separate photos, yeah.
But was that checked for any fingerprints or anything?
I'm trying to remember off of that one.
I understand.
I know it
They
was
won't
checked for, yeah.
I understand that the law enforcement won't let Kathleen Zeller.
Correct.
check
Right,
that.
that's one of the key pieces, yeah. When she filed in, let's see, sometimes years fly by. It was either late 16 or late 17. It was around November. No, I think it was 17. But she had filed for a bunch of pieces of evidence that she wanted to have tested. And several of the ones she did get tested, but there were several ones that prosecution either kind of balked at or gave excuses or kind of, say, let's get these ones done first. But yeah, this is one of those pieces of evidence that as of right now, as of us being here, that Zellner has not been able to get tested to see. But I'm pretty sure there was, and this is another interesting point, there were at least 8 fingerprints, handprints that were found on the vehicle that the police did test back in 05 and 06, and those absolutely were not Stephen Avery's fingerprints, nor were they Brendan Dassey's fingerprints.
Or anybody in the Avery family.
Right, that's right. They only compared, they didn't do a full, they didn't run it through the whole APHIS, which is a common law enforcement system for people that are already in the database, which then begs the question of whose fingerprints those are. They really didn't want to find that out. And that's something that you always find out in a lot of these wrongful conviction cases or corruption cases, misconduct cases, is that it's interesting to figure out what pieces of evidence that the prosecution or the police have that they really don't want to get to the bottom of. And you have that with these fingerprints, and then you certainly have that so far with that blinker light, where there was, there's really never been anything as of right now to figure out if there's DNA or fingerprints that were found on the blinker light. And if there is, whose it belongs to. Yeah.
So with all the opposition that Kathleen Zellner's experiencing,
Mhm.
do you think they'll ever find the murderer?
As far as I'll tell you this, I don't think anybody else in our lifetime will ever be prosecuted for the case if somebody else is proven to be the murderer. I don't think we'll have a situation like you did in Oklahoma, and it came out a few months ago. But the John Grisham Innocent Man book, which they just did a documentary on right around the same time as Making Murder Part 2, and it's a really good one. I'd suggest watch it if you're interested in true crime Netflix documentaries. But in that case, similar situation as the Avery case here, you had a guy that fingered the people that were convicted and wrongfully convicted of the crime, but in that case, eventually, that individual was prosecuted, and he's in prison now for the crime. I don't see that happening here. I would be really surprised, and it usually doesn't happen. It didn't happen in the Ryan Ferguson case that Zellner had, and it hasn't happened in a lot of her cases. Usually, what happens is the state or the prosecution, they kind of double down and refuse to admit, or don't want to be proven that they're wrong. You actually did see this happen, though, the opposite, though, to Jim Glasgow's credit here in Will County while I was gone, but he actually convicted Scott Eby of the Riley Fox murder down in Wilmington, whereas originally you had Kevin Fox wrongfully arrested by the Will County Sheriff's Department, sitting in jail and almost convicted of that case, years earlier. So Glasgow is kind of the opposite, and Zellner actually has a pretty good relationship with Glasgow, and she's always, based on her dealings with him, she's always thought highly of him, and he really respects her as well. So I just point that out that regardless of whether you like Jim Glasgow or not, it's up to all you. But at least Jim's the kind of guy that he's got a track record of proving that once he finds out, or at least he became aware of a case that was a potential wrongful conviction, the case went in a different direction. They did get the right person. Just knowing Jim, but knowing some of the people in Wisconsin, I'd be surprised. Although the 1% that sticks out to me is that you do have a new political system in Wisconsin now, whereas Scott Walker and the Attorney General for Wisconsin, Brad Schimmel, who actually had been in a band years earlier with the prosecutor of this case, just a small world that it is. They were in a band. What was it called? The Alibi?
The Alibis.
The Alibi.
Oh, God.
So you had Brad Schimmel, who was in Making a Murderer, who was and he was just really, just watching him, he seemed like a robot when you watch him at these press conferences when he was on the case, because he really fought, and I was actually at the prison in Wisconsin waiting for Brendan Dassey to get out of prison in November of 16. Yeah, I was at that prison waiting there for a couple of days, and lo and behold, you had the Attorney General then filing these last-minute emergency orders, and he won. He was able to get Brendan stopped from getting out of prison, and then he lost in Chicago in a court ruling, but then got one of these unbelievable rulings where he got the full court, which is called an en banc hearing, but he got the whole court to reconsider, and the case went 4-3, and now Brendan's in real bad shape. And that's why I tell people, Brendan's best hope at this point in time is Kathleen Zellner and Stephen Avery, because if she's able to prove that Avery didn't commit the crime, then it's pretty much understood that Brendan Dassey didn't participate in the crime. So, but just get back to your question. I see it very, very unlikely that 5 years from now, if we got back together, that we'd be having a conversation about, unless the other person that did it had a guilty conscience and and confessed, which is what that Scott Eby did in the Will County case. So it's always a possibility, but again, the people that Zellner is pointing the finger at as being the most likely suspects are Bobby Dassey and Scott Todich. So that would be, Bobby was Stephen's nephew. That's Brendan's one of Brendan's older brothers, and then Todich is married to Stephen's mother's, Stephen's sisters. That's her husband, and he was in Making a Murder Part 2. I would say somewhat prominently. You could see him, and I get in a lot of detail on him in my book, actually, as far as he has a very explosive and violent criminal history, and he actually worked at a plant
in Manitowoc that the Wisconsin aluminum factory where Zellner and other people actually suspected that Teresa Halbach's remains may have been incinerated just a few days after she disappeared back on Halloween of 2005. What was a drawback to help prove that case is that a lot of the people that work at the Wisconsin aluminum foundry are illiterate. I think like 40% of them or 50% of them, according to the HR person that has been there for years. So somebody wrote this letter that was very illiterate, but basically, suggesting that Halbach's body was incinerated at the aluminum, but they couldn't spell it right, at the smelter there. But nobody understood this letter back in 2005. And back in 2005, the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office, who the letter was addressed to, I think.
It was left at the
It was sent to the Green Bay Post Office. Yeah, that's right. But I think it mentioned Manitowoc County on it.
Yeah.
But anyway, there was no incentive.
It's Sickey.
Right. Which, that's another. Yeah, Sicky could be Skinny, which Skinny is the nickname of Scott Tadich. So. A lot of interesting things here. Yes.
Has the battery replaced in the red, or is that discussed in your book, or is that a new development?
The battery, no, that's a new development. I don't think I went into that. That kind of happened. It was starting to come to fruition right around the same time or shortly after. I think I was putting the book to bed. And I kind of passed that point of no return then. But I always thought, and again, thanks for pointing that out, because that's something, when I do the update, I could probably get into that too. I always thought that, the whole notion that, but I do get into the DNA. I spent a lot of time on the book on the DNA from the hood latch in the book. But I always thought this whole notion that if Stephen Avery, whoever did the murder, the notion that somehow that they're going to go to great lengths of disconnecting the battery so the vehicle's basically immobilized on the property, it's just something that I don't see any killer, whoever it was.
Well, they said it's because of the key fob, so somebody couldn't
I don't
just
believe
get
that.
the alarm.
Yeah, I mean, those are things that you think of now, years later, to kind of come up with any
Right.
theory to justify, keep your case from melting, if it's an iceberg. So, but yeah, any notion that whoever is a killer would somehow disconnect the battery after parking it on their own property, I just find that crazy. And again, there's been interesting developments with that battery, I think, in the last few months or so. I got to refresh my memory because I knew a little bit more about that back in probably November, December than I do right now. Then
It's a police battery. Police car battery.
Right? Was it from was it Crown? Vic?
Crown Vic.
Yeah, Crown Vic. Yeah.
Do you discuss the witness that noticed a white Jeep?
Yes.
Okay, because I think that kind of links back to the battery too now.
Yeah, and actually, I went out to his house this past summer to try to. I went there with a guy I know really well that knows that whole area inside and out, because it's always. Actually, I feel it always gives me more credibility, but frankly, I feel more confident knowing somebody that's lived there 50 or 60 years of their life and knows a lot of these people. But yeah, we went out to Wilmer Siebert's house, and it was one of those weird deals that I felt that he was home, but he wasn't answering the door. And I know I think since there was an article about him about 3 years or so ago that really caught the internet by storm and off guard, that he's tried to kind of stay under the radar. He's I think he's about 80 or 81 years old now, but he lived his property is kind of on that. I don't know if I have a good angle, even the show.
Are they going to do an annual?
But he kind of lives. His property is
celebration this
in the.
do, but
It's off
really
of.
do any good.
It's kind of basically the back area where you get into the quarry. I'm trying. Maybe it'll be off of. It's on Jambo Creek Road, and I don't see that on here. So I think it would be right. Jambo Creek Road runs right, basically down here on the bottom, but where the 15 is, but a little bit lower. But anyway, but what she's talking about is that there was a witness that came forward that was pretty confident that he saw two vehicles going into the back part of the quarry, which would probably have been the night before that the RAV4, was found the very next morning on Saturday. And again, he was kind of, dismissed and
really the police really didn't give much time of day to the guy back in '05, because that would have really been bad, especially if it was somebody in law enforcement that may have been one of the vehicles, possibly an Andy Colburn type a person. I always thought, I've talked about this before, I don't have a problem saying that, I always thought that if somebody's going to be involved in planting the vehicle, I do feel that it's likely somebody that's a cop in law enforcement has to be involved in that case, because there's more of an incentive for the police to find the vehicle, to have the probable cause that Stephen Avery's involved in the case, whereas the killer, for the most part, up until that point in time, really wouldn't. All they would care about is getting away with the crime. So they're not gonna, at that point in time, be as motivated. So, but the one thing that Andy Colburn had versus pretty much everybody else on the case that was in law enforcement is that he regularly had been to Avery Salvage Yard, because he owned a bunch of old Plymouths and was really into classic cars and trucks. So he owned a bunch of these, and he had spent a lot of time out at the Avery Salvage Yard in the years prior, and knew Earl Avery pretty well just from being out there a lot. So I always give that in my mind, especially from being out at this property, is that I've always kind of discounted the theory that a random stranger committed the crime, even when people were talking about possibly Ryan Hilgis or Scott Bloder being involved in the crime, and that's Teresa's ex-boyfriend, and the other guy she lived with that, back in the Hilbert area. But just from being out this property, you really have to kind of know this area inside and out, like the back of your hand, to be able, I feel, to kind of get away with the crime. And that's kind of what Zellner's always felt strongly too, that whoever would have done this crime, if it was somebody other than Stephen Avery, has to really know this area really well, because just a stranger would get lost out here and wouldn't be able to commit the crime and leave the evidence in the places that was turned out. So yes.
After watching Netflix and about this whole thing, it doesn't seem, I got the impression that he didn't have a mean bone in his body, it seemed to me. I was wondering what his friends up there, the people that live in that town, their general conception of which way, guilty or not guilty.
You're talking about for Stephen Avery?
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say it's publicly, as far as what you'll see on TV, you would think it's like 99% against Stephen Avery, because that's the way a lot of the television stations, and frankly, even the local newspaper in Manitowoc tries to portray it, because it's just advantageous for everybody, because nobody wants to admit they're wrong, and there's a great incentive now, and there has been ever since Mickey Murray came out, to not look like a fool, and for everybody, the police, the television stations, the politicians, the local community for that matter. But kind of spend a lot of time out there and get a chance to know a lot of people. I'd say it's kind of more divided. It's probably 50-50 or maybe 60% think Stephen Avery is guilty and 40%, which is still a big difference compared to 100% were convinced that he was guilty just from watching the press conference that Ken Kratz had, months, a year before Stephen Avery and Brendan went to trial. So I think that there's a lot of people, especially people that understand the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office, and a lot of corruption that they've had over the years in other cases, that a lot of people once you understand that and realize that Stephen Avery's case, the Hallbeck case, is not an isolated incident, then you have to step back and realize that these guys are capable of planting evidence and fabricating a crime scene because they have experience at doing it, and they may be pretty good at it. So that's just my take. But I think that as time has gone on, a lot more people today think that Stephen Avery had nothing to do with the case, and certainly that Brendan had nothing to do with the case. But yeah, I'm kind of like you. If you realize that he didn't commit the 1985 rape, and he didn't, and if you strongly believe that the evidence doesn't show he did this case, then you're left with a guy that was in his 20s that was, acting like a jackass a few times, in his 20s, doing some thefts, acting goofy with friends at a bonfire, but other people have done a hell of a lot worse. So in my opinion, there's nothing that points to Stephen Avery being like a sociopath or a psychopath that was destined to, once he got out of prison, to go out and kill, tons of people. It's kind of the opposite. Actually, if you want to look at people like that, you would look at Ken Kratz, the prosecutor, and look at his behavior, which I get into in great detail in my book. And then compare as far as who's a more deviant individual when it comes to being a predator dealing with women, Stephen Avery or Ken Kratz, and I'll let you make your own decision. So,
I got this. That was pretty interesting.
okay.
Thank you so much,
Carmen
Dennis.
Bootwell.
What's her name?
Carmen Bootwell.
Carmen, but yeah.
Just so everybody, if you did get a book, and I'd certainly be willing to sign it if you haven't had it signed. And I also do have a few of the other books I've done over the years as well that are pretty interesting cases. A couple, are wrongful conviction cases. The other one's a lot like In Cold Blood, the Truman Capote case. That one's called Bloody Lies. So thanks very much for coming. I really appreciate it, and definitely continue to keep up on the case because this will be a big year, I think, as things continue to unfold.